family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I am your host, Tierney Cherie, here to you with a new video. Before we get started, I have to remind you all, if you have not and you would like to subscribe to my Telegram channel, the link to that is down in the description. Telegram is a decentralized app that I update anytime that I post a video. In addition, if you want to stay connected, you can also add yourself to my Patreon. There I will post videos that are exclusive and also share different articles and things that I think might be relevant to us inside of this African experience. With that, let's get started with African and World News. Apartheid Israel wants to lecture migrants, particularly African migrants, that they should stop coming into their territory. Very ironic given the fact that apartheid Israel is a settler colonial state. So let's talk about what's going on as far as Israel's tension with their Eritrean community. Israel's Netanyahu wants the immediate deportation of Eritreans after Tel Aviv violence. Israel is considering tough steps, including the immediate deportation of Eritrean asylum seekers involved in riots in Tel Aviv last Saturday. Some 170 people were injured in violent clashes with police and infighting between groups of supporters and opponents of Eritrea. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said a red line had been crossed. He's putting his foot down. He ordered a new plan to remove, get this, all African migrants that he described as illegal infiltrators. We have to talk about the irony of this label, obviously. Saturday's unprecedented disorder began after activists opposed to the Eritrean government said that they had asked Israeli authorities to cancel an event organized by their country's embassy. They broke through a police barricade around the venue, which was then vandalized. Police in riot gear fired tear gas, stun grenades, and live rounds as officers on horseback tried to push the protesters away. And to give a little bit more context about this protest, my understanding is that the people opposed to the Eritrean government were TPLF, either members or sympathizers or affiliates, people who are affiliated with TPLF. TPLF, if you don't know, was the target of a war recently, as they are deeply aligned with U.S. interests and stirred up conflict inside of not only Eritrea, but also in Ethiopia. So this group has affiliations with them and was protesting the presence of the Eritrean government inside of Israel. That's what's being reported. The rioting has put the divisive issue of migrants back on the political agenda at a time when Israel is already split over the hardline government's highly controversial judicial overhaul plan. Mr. Netanyahu and others in his cabinet have blamed the Supreme Court for blocking earlier attempted actions to force migrants out of Israel. Again, the irony cannot be lost on us. Now, there remains a serious problem with illegal infiltrators. In Tel Aviv and elsewhere, the Prime Minister said at Sunday's special government meeting, "We want harsh measures against the rioters, including the immediate deportation of those who took part." He requested that the ministers present him with plans for removal of all of the other illegal infiltrators. So the irony, of course, that's not being lost on us is that the entire state of Israel is an illegal state, as the Palestinians, whether or not they regard their state as legal, they would probably call them illegal infiltrators, illegal terrorists, an illegal government that is trying to commit ethnic cleansing inside of a legitimate state. So the irony cannot be lost. They are upset that there are so many African asylum seekers coming into Israel, and they want to now label them as criminals. I've seen people call them criminals or gangs, and trying to now play the victim inside of a state that is literally an apartheid regime. So the irony, again, is not lost on us. But again, we have to keep in mind people who seek their seek refuge inside of an apartheid state have to be subjected to those laws. I never understand people who seek refuge inside of Israel, whether that be Beta Israel, okay, who has fled Ethiopia, so to speak, for some type of violence, and they said that they're going to run to the arms of an Israeli state, claiming that they are a part of that legacy, or whether it's Eritreans who are TPLF affiliated, who are running from their government, they say, and running into the arms of an apartheid state. So if you're running to a white supremacist state, you're running into a settler colony to be your refuge, and then you want to feel upset when you realize, hey, you guys are racist. Hey, you guys are discriminating against us. You're treating us this way because we're Africans. Then you have to evaluate what you basically did to yourself. You put yourself right in the line of fire from a notably racist country. Israel's a racist country. Anyone who's going there expecting rights, despite the fact that Palestinians who are indigenous to that place are receiving no rights, not just no rights, they're being slaughtered on a daily basis, but you want them to respect your rights there, you're kidding yourself. So this should be a lesson. Those who want to seek refuge in the arms of your oppressor, seek refuge amongst your people if you're going to go that route. So with that, let's go to the next story. So it looks like the G20 just became the G21, and Africa is to thank for that. So we're going to talk about this story. Essentially, the African Union has been added to the G20. Is that something that should be celebrated as some people are celebrating? Is this something that's being done for strategic reasons? Does it mean anything for the average African? That's what we're going to talk about now. The G20 summit, how diplomacy of Modi's Bharat pulled off the African Union's inclusion. G20 New Delhi Summit, African Union's inclusion in the League of World's Wealthiest Nations is being described as a move towards a brighter future for the global South. The geopolitical ripples from the gavel hammered by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi in New Delhi to announce the inclusion of the African Union in the group of 20 nations held particular significance for 55 African nations that potentially transformed the G20 into the G21. This was on September 9, 2023. Modi invited the chair of the African Union, Azali Assoumani, to take his seat as a permanent member of the League of the World's Wealthiest Nations as other leaders applauded and looked on, hailing it as a step towards the collaborative future in the G20's collective commitment to global progress. Modi chaired the African Union's inclusion to the G20 as a move towards a brighter future. So something else interesting, it says, now up until the G20 summit in 2022, the African Union had been a guest invitee to one of the world's most powerful geo-economic bodies. Amid calls for equitable representation for the countries of the global South, the African Union, however, continues to be a guest invitee in other major global organizations, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He says it gives a fresh wind to the idea and inclusion of multilateralism, just as India has actively supported the idea of bringing the AU into the G20. The world will someday soon recognize that India and Africa's representative states should be included in the UN Security Council, said Rajiv Bhatia, a former Indian ambassador. And it says the expansion of the G20 shows a larger desirability for inclusive multilateralism in the global governance bodies. That's what he pointed out. India has been campaigning, emphasize this, India has been campaigning to amend the UN Charter to create additional permanent seats at the UN Security Council. And since 2005, India is a part of a group called the G4. This is a political cooperative alliance comprising Brazil, Germany, India, Japan, who support each other's bids for permanent seats in the UN Security Council while calling for equitable representation in multilateral and global governance bodies. So a lot of interesting things here. Number one, let's just talk about the idea that this is a move forward for Africa, a move for progress for Africa. By now, Africa, I hope that you know to call these things BS whenever you have inclusion inside of international bodies that are created to reinforce the current world order that we're living in, created to it reinforced imperialism and the colonial state or colonial international system rather. So anytime that we have inclusion inside of that, hopefully now we know to call this idea that it's progress for us. It's complete nonsense. Just like if you remember just recently, you had all these people who were so happy whenever the World Trade Organization allowed a African woman to head that agency. What did everyone say? This is a move forward. This is going to move us into the right direction. This is going to be good for Africans. Africans, I will ask you, has your life changed from having a African head of the World Trade Organization? Has your economic livelihood become better? Has your country shifted inside of any type of way where the business interest of your country is going to be represented on a global scale? I'm willing to bet that the answer to all three of those questions is no. So this is another symbolic gesture. If you understand the G20 is the world's 20 most wealthy or powerful countries. This is the 20 most wealthy or powerful countries, right? Yet Africa, they're not going to admit a African country. That has to be emphasized. They're going to admit the African Union, which is comprised of 55 nations. So this is, in my opinion, just as much of an insult as just keeping you as an invitee. You're going to have France be able to go to the G20 in and of itself. You're going to have the United States going to the G20. You're going to have China going to the G20. You're going to have India going to the G20. You're going to have Russia going to the G20. You're going to have all of these countries in and of themselves who are sufficient to stand on their own and go to the G20 and be looked at as a representation of the world's economic elite. Yet the African Union has to have 55 countries have a single seat at the G20, and this is a move in a positive direction. And I told you recently that Nigeria just put out the idea that they were going to petition to join the G20, and I told you I don't think it's going to happen. Nigeria is not in any way economic power hub as the same way as a country like an India or China. Like, it's just not. And the idea that they would get this inside of a post-BRICS situation where basically Ethiopia is just let into BRICS, if they were to get entrance into the G20, it would only be as a way to try to lessen the stigma towards there being a divide in the world. That's what some people are trying to do. In my opinion, India could be definitely that middleman that's trying to lessen the stigma of there being a BRICS, because even though India is a member of BRICS, a founding member of BRICS, understand that India is still a U.S. ally. India is also not necessarily so closely aligned with certain BRICS members, notably China. So all because you have certain countries that are joining BRICS, don't think that what's happening is necessarily a change in or a global divide where some people are choosing sides. Some people are staying neutral and looking out for their own interests, and India is one of those countries. So allowing the African Union in could be a way to also try to calm down the other allies of India or the other allies of the Western world order and let them know that India or other countries that are joining BRICS are not trying to freeze out the West. That's at least how I interpret this. It could be a number of things. Definitely interested to hear what your perspective is on that. But I want to emphasize this is not something that is for our good. We're not in an economic powerful situation. That's the other great insult about this. So you have all of these countries that are standing there because of their economic power, and then Africa is given a symbolic seat at the G20, meaning how is that a step in a positive direction if our economies are still as depleted as they are, despite the fact that we know that the African continent is rich and should be the economic powerhouse that China is if Africa actually controlled its resources. So it's an insult. We're going to give you a symbolic seat even though we know that you not only are not able to be in a powerful situation, but you cannot be in a powerful situation because we are in a powerful situation. We have the resources, we have the power. So it's literally an insult, in my opinion. Something else, though, I want to note about this is India. It's very interesting that they are trying to make this into a furtherance of their own agenda that they've been trying to achieve for a while, by the way. India has been trying to get a seat on the UN Security Council, and they feel like they basically check all the boxes as far as being a major world economy. And there's only 5 members of the Security Council. They want to be one of those members. Now, India is still considered the global south, and yet you have the 5 countries that are inside of the Security Council being the US, Russia, France, China, and I'm missing one, the UK. These 5 countries are holding on to this idea that they are going to be the ones to decide the interest of the entire world. Africa's been asking for a seat on the Security Council. I'm so sure that's not going to happen. I'm just so sure. And if that were to happen, it would literally be some type of way to undercut Africa the same way that they are being let into the G20. So India, though, could very well be let into the Security Council. Germany is actively trying to get in the Security Council. The other nations, it was Japan, and I forget the last. Oh, and Brazil, that's the other country actively trying to get into the Security Council. So they're using this basically to further the narrative that we should be allowed inside of institutions. We should be represented inside the world's economy, inside of different institutions that represent the world's economy, even if we don't have the power that you have. So this is just setting a precedence for their own agenda. I hope that you all realize that. But definitely want to hear your thoughts on African Union's admission to the G20, now making it the G21. And with that, let's talk more about what happened at the G20. Something else that happened at the G20 that you should be aware of, Joe Biden essentially was embarrassed on the issue of Ukraine. Biden finds himself on the defensive after G20 leaders failed to rally around Ukraine. This article goes on to say that the President Joe Biden failed at a weekend summit in India to unite world leaders around a condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine, drawing a rebuke from Kiev and putting him on the defenses as he wrapped up a trip abroad. Neither Russian President Vladimir Putin nor Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the New Delhi gathering for leaders of the world's most powerful economies. But even in their absence, Russia and China notched a win against the United States when it came to rallying the international community against the war that began more than a year and a half ago. The group of 20 nations declined explicitly chide Russia for the invasion, saying instead the country should refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition, and lamented the human suffering and negative added impacts of the war. So this is very, very significant because if you understand how the United States and the West has been really freezing out Russia, has been trying to build coalition. But the fact that they actually refuse to outright condemn Russia is telling that the world is kind of growing tired with the foreign policy that the West has been seeking in order to enact this war in Ukraine and ultimately to throttle Vladimir Putin, which I think is the ultimate goal of Ukraine. The other interesting thing, though, is that I think Joe Biden really wanted this win because Russia is a member of the G20. So if Russia was actually condemned at a meeting that they were attending, and China, being an ally of Russia, was also there for that, that would have been a huge blow inside of the face of Russia, showing that the international community has essentially turned their back on them, and even their allies had. But the fact that they refused to do that shows that instead the United States seems to be losing the narrative war. So let's read on. It says, although Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky attended last year's G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, he was not present at the New Delhi gathering. India, which is not aligned in the war, did not invite Ukraine, despite a request from the U.S. officials who argued that Ukrainian officials should have the ability at the forum to rebut Russia's narrative about the war. Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Ministry voiced disappointment on social media with the G20 statement, sharing a mock-up of changes it would have liked to seen that would have pinpointed Russia as the aggressor nation. My question is, how many times does Ukraine have to go on with this narrative? Have to go on with, oh, we're the victim, it's Russia, it's Russia, it's Russia. Essentially, they want to keep it inside of our minds that they're trying to fight a war against this aggressor. They want it to be in our recent memory, and that's why he wants to go to every single meeting that he has a chance to go to. But I think it's very interesting that he was not allowed to go to the G20 this year, that even though Vladimir Putin was also not there and neither was Xi Jinping, still you had the United States lose out and basically lose a significant blow to their international stance, being the world police, being the one who decides everything around the world, that they could not get the world to unite on this issue of outwardly condemning Ukraine, or at least the G20, condemning Russia, sorry. So that's all I have for that one. Let's go to the next story. This is a story that definitely goes out of our subconscious, but if you are watching and you have a cell phone near you, hold up your cell phone and keep in mind that every single one of us are a part of what happens in the Congo when it comes to the mining of cobalt. Understand, as this article is about to describe, it goes beyond cobalt. It also goes to, or not just beyond cobalt, it goes beyond cell phones. It also goes to the New World Order's agenda to basically bring in the idea that there's going to be clean energy that's going to be of no threat to anyone. Is that true? Does clean energy, does these batteries, rechargeable batteries, are these things going to come at no cost to everyone, or is it just going to be no cost to certain people? So let's talk about this article. Cobalt copper mining leading to forced evictions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, this is according to Amnesty International. Always when it comes to Amnesty International, let's emphasize that they are typically the mouthpiece of the world order. They're trying to turn us into a certain direction, but they do report facts many times. So we can't just disregard the reports. In this case, we do know for a fact that the Congo is being mined at a extreme pace, so to the point that our people there, many have been relegated to a state of slavery. So I think we can believe what they're saying in this instance. Now, in the report published Tuesday, it entitled "Fueling Change or the Status Quo," Amnesty International, they're based in the DRC's Initiative for Good Governance and Human Rights, analyzed the human rights impact of 4 projects in the Kolwezi mining region, southeast of the DRC, and forced evictions of the populations from their homes and fields. These evictions carried out when companies seek to expand industrial mines, destroy lives, and must stop immediately, says Agnes Calamard, Secretary General of Amnesty International. Instead of benefiting from the growth of the mining sector, people living in Kolwezi region are being forced to leave their homes and farmland to make way for the expansion of large-scale industrial mining projects. These evictions are often carried out by mining operators who have little regard for the rights of the populations concerned and equally little respect for national laws designed to limit forced evictions linked to the mining sector. Let me just finish with this one point right here. It says the DRC is the largest mining producer and supplies 70% of the world's cobalt, a crucial metal to batteries that are used in electronics and electric cars. Okay, electric cars. Amnesty International recognizes the importance of rechargeable batteries in the energy transition. However, writes the NGO, decarbonizing the global economy must not lead to a new human rights abuse, which it is. Basically, the whole idea to have clean energy has led to numerous human rights abuses in the African continent, not just because of mining minerals, but also the discarding of the waste that these batteries cause. So I want to bring this forward to you and ask you, although you might feel like clean energy comes at no cost, it's coming to a cost at the African continent. So when we hear people pushing for this as being a solution, can this be a solution for Africa? It's being done, the way it's being done is utilizing resources that belong to the African continent, but of course they never want to pay full value, and they surely don't want to pay the Congolese for these resources, so they'll mine it and pay the Congolese nickels and cents. And meanwhile, they will take these things and sell them at high cost in order to empower themselves. This is how the imperialists work. So we have to keep that in mind whenever you want to talk about clean energy. I would like you or encourage you to do so in a way that is equitable to the interests of Africans and representative of the fact that in this battle, we are losing, okay? We are literally being the ones who are being sacrificed for the West. So that's something that has to be emphasized and remembered. So let's go to the last story. This is another story it's good to keep in your subconscious. Now, there's been a number of natural disasters that have hit Africa in the past week. If you didn't know, there was an earthquake in Morocco. I believe 2,500 people did. And also just recently, there was another natural disaster that happened in Libya. I believe 10,000 people. That's what the last number that I saw. 10,000 people killed in a flood. Could you imagine just like that? A flood that wipes out 10,000 people. Why don't we hear about these things happening in the West? I've never heard of a single catastrophic event that just wipes out infrastructure like that as it does inside of places in the global South. Well, we know why. It's because of infrastructure that has been compromised, infrastructure that's been jeopardized because of the imperialist ambitions of the European state. So if you understand that, then you also have to understand what's happening in Libya is a direct consequence of what happened when NATO decided to unseat a legitimate leader, Muammar Gaddafi, and to install a government that was not going to do things like keep up with infrastructure. So we're going to talk about that right now. So Libya's chaos left its people vulnerable to deadly flooding. A storm that has killed thousands of people, left thousands more missing in Libya, is the latest blow to a country that has been gutted by years of chaos and division. The floods are the most fatal environmental disaster in the country's modern history. Years of war and a lack of central government have left it crumbling. It's left with crumbling infrastructure that was vulnerable to the intense rain. Libya is currently the only country yet to develop a climate strategy according to the United Nations. I know we just talked about climate. Now, videos of the aftermath show water gushing through the port city's remaining tower blocks and overturned cars, and later bodies lined up on sidewalks covered with blankets collected for burial. Residents say the only indication of danger was the loud sound of the dam. Remember dams? This is something we're familiar with, right? The dams cracking with no warning system or evacuation plan. Here's a look at why the storm was so destructive and what obstacles stand in the way of getting aid to those who need it the most. So essentially, the reason why 10,000 people got wiped out just like that from a heavy rainstorm, a crazy heavy rainstorm, but that many people got wiped out because two dams, the infrastructure basically let out and people died. Now, I'm going to skip to the end of the article because I want to emphasize this. Much of Derna, which is what the part of Libya that was hit, was constructed when Libya was under Italian occupation in the first half of the 20th century. It became famous for its scenic white beachfront houses and palm gardens. But in the aftermath of Gaddafi's ouster in 2011, it disintegrated into a hub for Islamist extremist groups, was bombarded by the Egyptian airstrikes, and later besieged by forces loyal to Haftar. The city was taken by Haftar's forces in 2019. Like other cities in the east of the country, it has not seen much rebuilding or investment since the revolution, or really the ouster of Gaddafi, because it was a Western-sponsored coup. It says most of its modern infrastructure was constructed during the Gaddafi era, including the toppled Wadi Derna Dam, built by Yugoslav company in 1970s. According to Jalal Harcharo, an associate fellow specializing in Libya and at the London-based Royal United States Institute for Defense and Security Studies, Haftar views the city and its population with suspicion and has been reluctant to allow it too much independence. Last year, for instance, a massive reconstruction plan for the city was led by outsiders from Benghazi and elsewhere, not natives of Derna. Tragically, this mistrust has proven calamitous during the upcoming post-disaster period. So this is another issue of where you see what happens whenever NATO or the U.S., the Western imperialists, basically go and do what they always do. That is disturb, that is disrupt, that is destabilize countries that are stable, that are taking care of their people, that are doing right by their people. They destabilize them and they leave them completely unable to manage their own affairs. This is why so many people died in Libya, because of what happened whenever the United States and France and NATO decided that Gaddafi had to go because he was jeopardizing their interests, and he jeopardized their interests because he wanted to do what he could to enforce a more independent Africa. And also he wanted obviously to have a pan-African currency that's going to be backed by gold, something that would have completely reversed the roles as far as power inside of the world. And this is why things like the G20 have to be written off, because whenever we make real power moves, whenever someone says, let's do something that's going to empower the African continent, what happens? The United States is not applauding as they were whenever they let the African Union inside of the G20. The United States is not going to be there voting yes. No, the United States is going to be there saying no, and let's get these Africans who are causing this independent mindset out of power. This is how they operate in the world. So we cannot fall for symbolic gestures. Understand who your enemies are, and that your enemies will never want to see you free. This is a common trait when it comes to the imperialists. They'll never want to see you free, and they'll never be happy seeing an Africa that is empowered to take care of its own destiny, or an African people who are independent enough to do so. So with that, that's all I have for this episode. I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Africa gave monotheism to the world, belief in one God. And at the time that Africa gave monotheism to the world, belief in one God, every other area surrounding Africa were believing in cows, were believing in moons, were believing in the sun. It was Africa and Africa alone that gave monotheism to the world. That is why Judaism had to be born in Africa. It presented the proper conditions for Judaism to be born there. Sigmund Freud, in his book Moses and Monotheism, his last book, and the book usually hidden, it's hard to get, and I don't see why. I find the book to be a particularly interesting book, and the conditions under which it were written. Mr. Freud began to write the book, I believe, in Austria, and because of Nazi occupation, he had to leave, and he took all the notes with him and went to Britain and hurried very much to write the book. Of course, this book, the Moses and Monotheism, here Freud comes to show through archaeological proofs, Freud comes to show through historical proof, Freud comes to throw through psychoanalytical proof that Judaism began in Africa, and not only this, but Moses himself was an African. Of course, the early priests of the religion were Africans, as they had to be. They were the ones who recorded the religion. Thus, when I take a position against Zionism, for example, when I hear people tell me that I'm anti-Semitic, which makes no sense at all because Judaism has nothing to do with Semitic people. One is a religion, the other is a biological specification, and the Palestinians certainly are Semitic. Mr. Arafat is a Semite. So if I support the Palestinians, I cannot be anti-Semitic, that's clear. But this is all confusion here. And this confusion is well done to keep people more confused. But we're revolutionaries, and we believe in dialectics. Out of confusion comes clarity. Because our time is limited and we want a lot of time for question, we want to make it clear. Judaism was given to the world by Africa. This is clear and undeniable fact. Those who wish to look at the history and we can develop it, look. Zionism is a political philosophy. It did not come out of Africa. The first organizational conference of Zionism, if my memory serves me correctly, was in 1897 in a place called Bals, Switzerland. B-A-L-S-E. The reason why this meeting had to be held in Bâle, Switzerland was because the majority of Orthodox Jewry in Europe was against Zionism, totally against it. We must look properly at Zionism, its beginning, and its founder, a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L. Mr. Herzl was, of course, bourgeois from his toes to his top of his head. He was bourgeois. As bourgeois as you can get. He didn't think about the proletarian. As a matter of fact, Mr. Herzl himself was not a religious person. It's extremely important. And we want to read his diary. He himself says that he's an atheist. You must understand the word properly. An atheist does not just not believe in God. An atheist makes the affirmative statement that God does not exist. Thus, Mr. Herzl is an atheist. I could never understand, until this day it is incomprehensible for me to understand. How is it that Zionism, a political philosophy, born thousands of miles away from Judaism, one born in Africa, the other in Europe, born thousands of years different from Africa, thousands of years of difference, Judaism thousands of years ago, Zionism 1897. And how is it that they can link each other together? And according to the philosophy of Zionism, that they feel that somehow that they have some relationship to Judaism and this promised state that God promised his chosen people. Mr. Herzl did not believe in God. Not only did not believe in God, he said that God did not exist. Now, he who tells me that God does not exist sets out to find a place that God promised to his chosen people. If this is not ludicrous, and this is the basis, of course, of Zionism, so you can see here the contradictions just everywhere. This is the time when Zionism comes to rise. Zionism comes to look for a state when everywhere else in the world is already dominated. Thus, in order for Mr. Herzl to get a country for Zionists, what he did was to attach himself to imperialism, British imperialism in this case, quite specifically. Of course, as an African who suffered under the heels of British imperialism, I can have no love for it, and certainly I cannot love anyone who attaches themselves to it and attaches themselves to it for the foundation of a state and then call this a liberation movement. Liberation movements fight against imperialism, not with it. Clearly here. Yes. The legal foundation of the State of Israel is what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This declaration was issued in 1917. A man in the government of Britain named Balfour wrote a paper and promised the Jews a national home. The national home he promised them was an area which Britain was colonizing, Palestine. Palestine didn't belong to the British. Just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British, even though they have troops there. But here, these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews and they accepted it. Where is the morality for this? If you say that Israel belongs to you, then you don't go to a thief to get Israel, you go and take it. Once you go to an immoral being such as British imperialism, and this is the basis for you getting the land, then clearly here those who are truly liberation fighters must question this. The basis, we say, is the Balfour Declaration, and Zionists know it. The Zionism is certainly not a liberation movement because it never fought against any imperialism. As a matter of fact, today, Zionism is the baby, child, and infant protector of imperialism in the Middle East. It carries out the interests of American imperialism. As a matter of fact, Zionism and American imperialism is like this. If our tax dollars would stop giving money to Israel, the state would sink tomorrow. And certainly no one can deny that American imperialism is the leading imperialist nation in the world. So we cannot see how a liberation movement is so tied, string and hand to American imperialism. They work hand in hand with American imperialism. Thus they can hardly be a liberation movement.